Some reunions happen on stages, in front of crowds, with cameras ready. This one happened in a quiet hallway, backstage in Las Vegas, where nobody was watching at all. It was the early 1980s, inside one of the large hotel showrooms that lined the Las Vegas Strip. The kind of building with a maze of corridors behind the stage, painted concrete block walls, exposed pipes overhead, and doors leading to dressing rooms, equipment storage, and loading areas that the audience out front never saw. Kenny Rogers was minutes away from going on. His band was already in place, the house lights were dimmed, and somewhere beyond the heavy curtain, 1,000 people were settling into their seats, waiting for the show to begin. In the hallway behind the stage, Kenny moved the way performers move in those final minutes. Quickly, but not rushed. The walk of someone who had done this so many times that his body knew the route even when his mind was somewhere else. To understand why this particular night mattered, it helps to understand where Kenny Rogers had come from and how far that hallway in Las Vegas actually was from where his career had started. Years earlier, Kenny had been the lead singer of the First Edition, a group that had built a real following in the late 1960s and early 1970s. Hit records, television bookings, a name that meant something on a marquee. But by the mid-1970s, the group had quietly come apart, the way a lot of bands come apart. Not through some dramatic falling out that made headlines, but through the slow accumulation of small decisions, schedules that stopped lining up, members drifting toward other projects, a momentum that simply stopped renewing itself. Kenny had gone on to build a solo career that, by the early 1980s, had grown into something far bigger than the First Edition had ever been. He filled rooms like this one in Vegas. His face was on album covers in record store windows across the country. The group that had once been his entire identity had become, for most of the public, a footnote. A name mentioned occasionally in articles about his early years, but rarely thought about by the audiences filling up the showroom that night. For Kenny himself, though, the First Edition had never really become a footnote. It had simply become a part of his life that he didn't think about often. Not because it was painful, exactly, but because the pace of his solo career left very little room for looking backward. There were always new songs to learn, new shows to play, new cities to move through. The First Edition belonged to a version of his life that felt, by this point, almost like it had happened to someone else. A younger man in a smaller world with a different kind of future ahead of him. The hallway he was walking through that night in Vegas was about as far from that earlier world as it was possible to get. Vegas showrooms in this era were built for scale. Long corridors that connected dressing rooms to the wings of the stage, wide enough for equipment carts and lighting rigs to move through, lined with framed photographs of past performers who had played that same room. The air backstage had its own particular quality, a mix of cigarette smoke, hairspray, and the faint metallic smell of old wiring, underneath the constant low hum of air conditioning working to keep a room full of people comfortable under hot stage lights. Crew members moved with purpose, carrying cables, adjusting headsets, calling out times until curtain. For Kenny, all of this was simply the environment of his job, familiar to the point of being almost invisible, the way a person stops noticing the layout of a house they've lived in for years. He was running through the set list in his head, the way he did before every show, not because he didn't know the songs, but because the small ritual of mental preparation helped him settle into the right frame of mind before walking into a room full of people. A few crew members passed him in the hallway, nodding, exchanging the kind of brief greetings that happen dozens of times backstage in the minutes before a show. Everything about the next 10 minutes was, on the surface, completely routine. The kind of routine that, for Kenny, had become almost automatic after years of shows just like this one. And then, coming the other way down the hallway, was someone Kenny hadn't seen in years. It took a moment for it to register, the way recognition sometimes takes a moment when you see someone completely out of context, in a place you never expected to see them. The man walking toward him was someone Kenny had spent years of his life with, back when both of their futures looked completely different. A member of the first edition. Someone who had shared stages, tour buses, and the particular kind of closeness that forms between people who spend that much time together in their 20s before any of them know how their lives are going to turn out. Neither of them had known the other would be there that night. There had been no plan, no message beforehand, no mutual friend who had mentioned it. It was simply one of those moments that happens, occasionally, in an industry where people's paths cross and uncross over decades. Two men who had once shared everything about their professional lives, walking toward each other in a hallway neither of them had any reason to expect the other to be in. For a second, neither of them said anything. It wasn't an awkward silence exactly, more like the kind of pause that happens when two people are processing something at the same time, trying to reconcile the person standing in front of them with the memory of who that person had been the last time they saw each other. Kenny had changed in the years since the first edition, not just in the obvious ways, the kind of changes anyone could see in a photograph, but in the less visible ways that come from years of a certain kind of success, a different bearing, a different pace, the unmistakable presence of someone who had spent years being recognized everywhere he went. And yet, in that hallway, none of that seemed to matter. For a moment, the years between them collapsed, and they were simply two people who had once known each other very well. Kenny had, at most, a few minutes before he needed to be in position for the show to start. The crew member calling time was somewhere down the hall, and the rhythm of a Vegas showroom didn't pause for anyone, no matter who they used to share a stage with. In those few minutes, Kenny had a choice to make. Not a dramatic choice, not one that anyone watching would have recognized as a choice at all, but a real one nonetheless. He could exchange a brief, friendly greeting and keep moving, the way two busy people often do when they run into each other unexpectedly. Or he could stop. He stopped. It wasn't a long conversation. There wasn't time for that. And the setting, a hallway minutes before a show, with crew moving past in both directions, wasn't built for long conversations anyway. But in the time they had, something passed between them that neither of them could have planned. They asked about each other's lives, the way people do after years apart, not with the polished, practiced answers either of them might have given in an interview, but with the more honest, abbreviated version that comes out when there's no time to dress anything up. There were no complaints, no old grievances raised, no awkwardness about how differently their careers had gone. Just two people, briefly, being exactly who they had been to each other years earlier. Not a star and a former bandmate, but two friends who had shared something neither of them had shared with very many other people. A few feet away, the rhythm of the showroom continued. Someone called out a time check. A stagehand moved past with a coil of cable over one shoulder. The hallway, despite this brief pause, never actually stopped moving around them, which made the moment itself feel even more private somehow. tucked into the middle of all that motion, visible to anyone who happened to glance over, but invisible in any way that mattered to the two people standing in it. When the time came, Kenny had to go. There was no dramatic goodbye, no long embrace, nothing that would have looked from the outside like anything more than two acquaintances saying a quick goodbye in a busy hallway. But for Kenny, walking the rest of the way to the stage that night, something had shifted, not in any way that affected the show itself, but in the quieter parts of his mind that exist underneath the performance, the parts that carry a person's sense of who they are and where they came from. He walked out onto that stage minutes later and gave, by every account, the kind of show audiences in Vegas had come to expect from him. Warm, confident, polished, exactly the performer the ticket holders had paid to see. Nothing about the show itself would have suggested that anything unusual had happened backstage. The audience had no idea. The band had no idea, beyond whoever might have noticed Kenny arrive at his mark a few seconds later than usual. It was, in every visible way, just another night in Vegas. But for Kenny, that hallway encounter became one of those small, private memories that performers sometimes carry for the rest of their lives. Not because anything dramatic happened, but because of what it represented. It was a reminder, arriving completely unannounced, of where his story had actually started. Not with the solo albums, not with the Vegas marquees, but with a group of young musicians who had no idea at the time how differently their lives were going to unfold. The first edition hadn't been a footnote after all. It had simply been waiting, quietly, for a moment like this one to remind Kenny that it was still part of him. What makes this story worth telling isn't the show that followed, or anything that happened afterward. It's the hallway itself. The unremarkable, unglamorous space between the dressing rooms and the stage where two old friends, for just a few minutes, were exactly who they used to be before either of them had any idea what their lives would become. No cameras, no audience, just two people recognizing each other in the middle of a hallway that neither of them would have been able to find again if they'd tried. For an artist who spent most of his life being watched, by audiences, by cameras, by an industry that turned every part of his life into something public, that hallway was something rare, a moment that belonged entirely to him and to one other person in a place where, for just a few minutes, nobody else was paying attention at all.